father dragged her from her bed before dawn and handed her over to a rugged mountain man as punishment for getting pregnant. Left in the freezing wilderness with a stranger who owed nothing to her, she thought her life was over. But what happened next, no one in Helena could have imagined. Snow was falling in thick, soundless sheets, swallowing the last signs of the road behind them. The wagon's wheels groaned, with every rut the mule's breath steaming in the frozen air. Clara Evans sat rigid on the splintered bench, her fingers raw, where rope had burned them that morning. Her father's grip still lingered on her scalp, where he'd dragged her from her bed before dawn. There had been no questions, no explanation, only the unshakable fact that she was being taken somewhere she would not be allowed to come back from. At 18, she was already ruined in the eyes of Helena. A rancher's daughter, belly swelling with the child of the sheriff's son, she had been transformed overnight from someone's daughter to something unworthy of a name. In the town's telling, she had seduced the boy, cornered him, trapped him. The truth that she had been promised love, a future, wasn't a story worth repeating. Rumors were easier to believe, especially when they fed a man's pride. Her father hadn't spoken since they left the ranch. His jaw was locked, eyes fixed ahead, as though the snow and the pine shadows were his only company. Clara tried once to speak to ask where they were going, but he silenced her with a single sharp look. That look told her what her mouth didn't want to form into words she was being given away. Hours later, when the trees grew so thick they seemed to swallow the light, the cabin appeared. It was small, hunched against the wind, a curl of smoke threading from the chimney. On the porch stood a man, broad shoulders under a coat of wolf pelt, face lined and shadowed by a beard, eyes as unreadable as the mountains behind him. Elias Cole didn't move when the wagon stopped, didn't greet them. He studied Clara with a glance so brief it felt like a dismissal, then turned his gaze to her father. No handshake, no words of business, only the passing of a rope, the transfer of a mule, and a sack of supplies. Clara's father jerked his head toward her, the barest tilt as if she were no more than part of the bargain. "Debts paid," he muttered, and the sound of it cut sharper than the wind. He didn't look at her again. The whip cracked, the mule lunged forward, and in moments the wagon was a blur of gray vanishing down the trail. The world was so quiet without the wheels that Clara could hear her own breath. She stood in the snow, her boots sinking into the crust, and for the first time in hours she let herself realize she was cold clear through. Her wrists throbbed. Her feet were numb. She might have stood there until the frost took her if the cabin door hadn't creaked open. The heat struck her first, the raw, aching sting of warm air meeting frozen skin. Inside, the fire glowed in a stone hearth. Shadows shifted across a rough table. A single cot pelts hung like muted flags along the walls. There were no curtains, no frills, nothing that spoke of another life. Only necessity. Only survival. Elias stepped past her without a word, set down the firewood he carried, and began to skin a rabbit at the table. His movements were practiced, precise, the kind of efficiency born of years doing a thing alone. Clara's eyes flicked to the rifle above the mantel, to the hunting knives laid in a row, to the faint smell of pine sap and smoke that clung to every surface. She waited for him to say something, to tell her where she should sleep or what he expected from her. But the only sounds were the scrape of his knife and the steady pop of the fire. After a few moments, she turned and shut the door herself, the latch clicking under her palm. It felt like sealing herself into a world she did not yet understand. That first night, she lay curled on the floor near the fire. The cot was untouched. She didn't ask for it, and he didn't offer. She clutched her arms around her middle, not from the cold, though the cold lingered, but to feel the small swell of her belly beneath her palms. She hadn't told anyone, but she already felt the flutter, sometimes the faintest reminder that she was carrying something more than shame. something alive. She told herself she wouldn't cry. Crying gave away too much. But the silence of the cabin was heavy, pressing against her ribs until the tears slid hot down her cheeks. Somewhere behind her, Elias shifted in his chair. She thought she heard him draw a breath as if to speak, but no words came. The fire crackled, and the wind outside began its low moan through the trees. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm she didn't know how to break. Elias rose before dawn, took his rifle, and disappeared into the trees. He returned at dusk with meat, sometimes wood, sometimes nothing at all. Clara kept the cabin swept, tried her hand at cooking. With what little she knew, mended a shirt she found in a trunk. He neither praised nor criticized. If he noticed, he didn't say. One afternoon, searching for cloths in the cupboard, she found a small wooden box. Inside lay 2 tarnished medals and a row of old photographs' faces in sepia, some stern, some smiling faintly. She touched the edge of a medal, tracing the grooves of its design. The ribbon was faded but strong. Civil War, she thought. Whatever he'd been before this life, it wasn't just a hunter in the mountains. She closed the box quickly when the door opened. Elias's eyes found hers and lingered a moment too long, but he said nothing. At night, the wind sometimes grew so fierce it rattled the shutters. Clara lay awake on the floor, staring into the firelight. She thought about Helena, about her mother's quiet hands in the garden, about the way Thomas, the sheriff's son, had smiled at her once like she was the only thing worth looking at. She thought about how quickly a promise could turn to a weapon. Elias never asked why she was there. She never offered. But each day that passed without the sound of wagon wheels or her father's voice made it clear she had been delivered to this place not to be saved, but to be forgotten. Still, as she watched the snow pile high against the cabin walls and felt the steady warmth of the fire on her skin, she wondered about the man who had taken her without asking her name. There was something about the way he moved, quiet, deliberate, as if everything he did was measured against an invisible ledger in his mind. She didn't know if she was in that ledger yet. She didn't know if she wanted to be. And somewhere in the stillness beneath the weight of isolation and the cold, a strange question began to form in her mind. Was this the beginning of the end of her life, or the beginning of something else entirely? The 5th morning began with the kind of pain that wakes you before your eyes are open. Clara gasped, clutching her belly as a tight, hot cramp gripped her from the inside. The air felt heavy in her chest. She pushed back the blanket and saw the dark stain blooming against the pale wool beneath her. For a moment, the room tilted, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not now, not yet." The cabin door swung open with a rush of cold air. Elias stepped inside, snow crusted across his shoulders, his breath visible in the dim light. His eyes swept the room, once catching the blood instantly. His rifle clattered to the floor as he crossed to her in 3 long strides. On the cot, he said, his voice sharp but steady. Clara didn't argue. She couldn't. The weight of his hands was firm and sure, as he guided her off the floor and onto the bed she'd never dared touch. The scent of pine and smoke clung to him. He moved fast after that, faster than she thought a man his size could. He stoked the fire until it roared, filled a kettle with snow, and set it on to boil. He fetched every pelt from the wall and layered them over her until she felt the weight pressing her into the cot. His fingers were rough from years of work, but when they touched her they were careful, deliberate. He checked the bleeding without flinching, his jaw set, eyes unreadable. He didn't say it would be fine. He didn't lie. Hours passed in the slow rhythm of water, boiling fire, popping wind, pushing against the shutters. Clara drifted in and out, sometimes from exhaustion, sometimes from fear. Each time she opened her eyes, he was still there, adjusting the blankets, offering water, adding wood to the fire. The pain eased and the blood slowed. When at last she could breathe without wincing, she found him sitting at the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. "You cared," she murmured, her voice raw from the hours of silence. He didn't look at her. "Don't flatter yourself." But his voice cracked just enough for her to hear the truth under the words. She didn't push him. She was too tired, and besides, she'd heard what mattered. The next morning, when she woke, her boots were by the fire, their cracked soles stitched neatly. A folded blanket rested at her feet. She didn't need to ask who had done it. 3 days later, the world vanished in white. The blizzard came without warning, a wall of wind and snow, swallowing the forest in minutes. The cabin shook under the force of it. Snow piled against the windows, burying the light. Elias rationed the food without discussion, moving in and out of the room with quiet efficiency. The silence between them was different now. It didn't scrape the way it used to, when the storm made the night indistinguishable from the day they sat across from each other at the table, the firelight drawing shadows up the walls. Elias spoke first, surprising her. "I had a sister," he said. "Younger than you. She died in the winter of '65. Fever took her." His voice didn't waver, but there was a tightness in it, as if he'd never spoken the words aloud until now. Clara told him about her mother's garden back in Helena, about how she used to press seeds into the soil and wait for them to sprout. She told him how she'd sit by the cottonwoods near the river and imagine her life unfolding somewhere else, somewhere quiet and safe. Her voice caught on the word safe. He didn't comment. On the second night of the blizzard, a sound broke through the howling wind, a faint, desperate bray. Elias pulled on his coat and was gone before she could speak. Hours seemed to pass before the door opened again, the cold following him in. Behind him stumbled a mule, ribs sharp against its hide, one leg dragging slightly. Clara's hands flew to its neck without thinking. Its ears flicked back, but it didn't pull away. "Whiskey," she said softly. "That's your name now." Elias built a lean-to against the shed, layering it with straw and blankets. Whiskey's breaths came slow, each one sounding like a question about whether this place could be trusted. Clara brought the animal scraps of carrot and spoke to it in low tones until its ears relaxed. Sometimes, when she looked up from brushing the frost from its coat, she found Elias watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered longer than before. When the storm finally broke, the sky was painfully blue, the air sharp in her lungs. Snowdrifts climbed higher than her waist. Clara stepped outside with whiskey at her side, the mule's breath puffing in rhythm with hers. The mountains stretched in every direction, white and endless, but for the first time she didn't feel swallowed by them. The silence was still vast, but it wasn't as heavy. That night, as she settled on her pallet near the fire, she noticed Elias had left the cot unmade as if it belonged to her now. She didn't move to take it, but the gesture stayed with her. She found herself wondering about the man who had crossed a blizzard for an animal who had sat by her through the worst hours without complaint. She wondered if this was the same man her father had called in a favor from, or if the mountains had carved someone different out of him. In the days that followed, she began to keep a journal. She had no intention of letting Elias know about it. The entries were short notes about the weather, about Whiskey's improving gait, about the way the light through the window seemed to change the color of the walls. But sometimes she wrote about him, about the way he moved through the cabin without disturbing the air, about how his silences no longer felt like walls, but like spaces waiting to be filled. It was a small thing, this act of writing, but it reminded her she still had a voice. That somewhere between the snow and the wood smoke, she might still be more than what she'd been called. And though she would never admit it aloud, she caught herself wondering what Elias thought when he looked at her, and why that answer suddenly mattered. The knock came just as the sun was dipping behind the pines, a sound so out of place in that remote corner of the Bitterroot that Clara froze with the ladle still in her hand. She glanced at Elias, who was sharpening his knife at the table. He didn't move for several heartbeats. The knock came again, quieter this time, but insistent. Clara set the ladle down and crossed the room, her pulse loud in her ears. When she opened the door, the cold air rushed in along with a boy's face she hadn't seen in over a year. Clara. His voice cracked on her name, and her breath caught. Samuel Evans looked older and smaller all at once. His cheeks were wind-burned, his lips split from the cold, his boots crusted with ice. He swayed slightly where he stood, and Clara reached for his arm without thinking. "What are you doing here?" He stumbled inside, shaking violently, his coat stiff with frost. Elias shut the door behind him, his gaze fixed on the boy. Samuel's eyes darted between them before landing on his sister again. "Pa's gone," he said, voice trembling. "Took off 2 weeks back." Sheriff came asking questions about Thomas, about what happened with you. His voice faltered. "Ma's sick, Clara. Bad. She kept saying I had to find you." She eased him onto the chair by the fire, her hands trembling as she pulled off his soaked boots. His socks were wet through his toes, pale as bone. Elias was already in the corner heating water without a word. Clara crouched in front of Samuel, studying his face. He'd grown taller, but there was a hollowness to him she hadn't seen before. "How did you get here?" she asked. "Walked most of it," he muttered. "Hitched a ride with the trapper for the last bit. Didn't have money for more." He looked down, ashamed. "I didn't know if you'd even want to see me." She felt her throat tighten. "You're my brother, Sam. That doesn't change." The decision formed almost before she realized it. She couldn't let her mother die without seeing her again. The next morning she packed what food they could spare. Elias didn't try to stop her, nor did he ask questions. He saddled whiskey, lashed down the packs, and by sunrise the three of them were moving down the trail. The air was brittle with cold, the kind that bites at your skin through wool. Snow still clung to the pines, and the creek they followed was half-frozen water murmuring under the ice. Samuel walked beside her, head down, his words few. Elias ranged ahead, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line like the forest itself was an enemy that needed watching. By midday, the quiet broke in a flash of muscle and fur. The cougar appeared from the shadows, a streak of tawny gold against the snow. It moved low, its eyes fixed on Samuel. Elias's rifle was already rising, but something in Clara surged before she thought. She stepped between the boy and the animal, arms spread wide, shouting as loud as her voice would carry. Her heart pounded in her ears, her boots sliding in the snow. The cougar froze its tail, lashing once then twice before it melted back into the undergrowth without a sound. When she turned, Samuel's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. Elias was watching her in a way he never had before, like he was reassessing something he'd thought was settled. He didn't say anything, but the look stayed with her for the rest of the journey. Helena was the same town she'd left, but it felt smaller now, meaner in its silences. People stared when they recognized her conversations, pausing mid-sentence as she passed. Some turned away quickly. Others held her gaze, their expressions unreadable. Her mother lay in the back bedroom of the small house, the air thick with the scent of sickness and wood smoke. She looked smaller than Clara remembered, her hair grayer, her breath shallow. When she saw Clara, her eyes filled with tears. She tried to sit up, failed, and reached a trembling hand toward her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice was fragile, but the words carried the weight of years. "I should have stopped him. I should have. You should have." Clara said softly, not to wound, but because the truth no longer had sharp edges. Her mother's eyes closed briefly as if the admission cost her something. I know. Clara stayed for the burial, the winter sky low and heavy over the small gathering. Samuel stood beside her, his gloved hand gripping hers tightly. She felt the eyes of the town on her but refused to lower her head. That night, Elias sat by the stove in the small front room, his hat in his lap. "We can leave whenever you're ready," he said quietly. "I'm ready now," she replied. When she told Samuel to pack his things, he didn't hesitate. Whatever life they might have had in Helena was gone, replaced by whispers and a kind of watching that never blinked. They left before dawn, the frost crunching under the mules' hooves. On the climb back into the mountains, Samuel walked taller, his eyes scanning the trees the way Elias did. Clara realized he wasn't just following her anymore. He was looking out for her, too. The trail wound higher, the air sharpening with each step, until at last the cabin came into view through the pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, the snow on the roof catching the pale light of late afternoon. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt the tightness in her chest ease. Whatever waited for them beyond those mountains could wait a little longer. Here, at least, they had a fire, a roof, and each other. The snow was just beginning to soften under the first breath of spring when the sound of hooves carried up the mountain. Elias was on the porch mending a harness, and Clara was at the table shelling beans with Samuel. They heard it at the same moment. In a place where visitors were as rare as rain in winter, the sound meant one of two things, news or trouble. When the rider broke through the tree line, both knew it was the latter. Marshal Reed dismounted without flourish, his boots sinking into the half-melted snow. His coat was dusty, his face shadowed with the kind of weariness that comes from long rides and bad tidings. He removed his hat, looking at Elias first, then Clara. "There's talk in Helena," he said without preamble. "Talk you're not going to like." Clara set the beans aside, her fingers tightening in her lap. Reed went on. "The preacher's stirring folks up again. He's saying you're a stain on the town, that justice wasn't done. There's a handful of men willing to take that talk and turn it into something worse. I don't know when, but it's coming." Elias didn't ask how the marshal knew, he only asked how many enough to matter. "Not enough to win if you're ready." Reed's eyes shifted to Clara. "I came to give you time to be ready." They didn't waste a moment. That afternoon, Elias took Samuel deep into the pines, showing him how to set snares, meant for men, not game loops, hidden beneath the snow that would yank a leg out from under the unwary. They marked choke points along the trail and cleared shooting lanes near the cabin. Samuel listened hard, his face more serious than Clara had ever seen. Inside, Clara began her own preparations. She salted and smoked what meat they had sealed jars of stew and stored them in the root cellar they dug before the first frost. She checked the pistols Elias had given her, practicing the motion of drawing and firing until it felt less like a foreign act and more like muscle memory. At night, she lay awake beside the low fire, listening to the wind thread through the trees, wondering if it was carrying the sound of boots up the trail. The attack came on a night without moon or stars. The forest seemed to hold its breath before it happened. Samuel, who had been tending to whiskey in the shed, spotted the first shadow slipping between the trees. He burst through the door, his voice low but urgent. 3 men, maybe more. Coming quiet. Elias's movements were deliberate as he reached for his rifle. Clara felt her pulse climb into her throat, but her hands were steady as she checked the pistol at her hip. Outside, the darkness was thick, but shapes emerged in the shifting snow. 3 figures keeping low, moving toward the cabin. The first stepped into the snare Samuel had laid earlier that day. The rope snapped tight and he hit the ground with a thud, the wind knocked from him. Samuel was there in a breath, holding him at stick's length, his voice steady. "Don't move." The second man raised a rifle, and for a split second Clara saw the glint of metal in the dark. Before he could aim, Elias stepped from behind a pine, his own rifle level and unshaking. "Drop it." The man hesitated, then let the weapon fall into the snow. The third turned to run, but Clara was already moving. She stepped into his path, her pistol raised, the hammer pulled back. Her breath steamed between them. "Don't take another step." When they searched the men, the truth of their intent lay heavy in Clara's hands, 3 bottles of kerosene rags stuffed into their mouths ready to be lit. They hadn't come to frighten them or drive them out. They'd come to burn them alive. Elias's jaw was tight, his voice low as he said, they weren't going to stop. In the flicker of the cabin's firelight, Clara read the letter they found in one man's coat. The seal was broken, the handwriting neat and cold. It was from a merchant in Helena, one of the preacher's patrons, offering payment for removing the problem in the hills. Payment for her death. When Marshal Reed arrived the next day, the prisoners were bound and bruised from a long night in the snow. He looked at Clara at the kerosene bottles lined on the porch rail. "They meant it," he said quietly. "They always did," she replied. Reed hauled them away, promising they'd face a judge. Before he left, he glanced at her again. "You made enemies in the right places. That's how you know you're winning." After he was gone, Elias repaired the snares, resetting them deeper along the trail. Samuel carried armloads of wood to the porch, stacking it high. Clara stored the letter in the same box where Elias kept his medals. She didn't know why, maybe as proof, maybe as a reminder. That night, the 3 of them sat by the fire, the danger still near enough to taste. No one spoke much. They didn't have to. The truth was clear in the way Samuel's eyes met hers, without flinching, in the way Elias's hand brushed hers when he passed her a mug of tea. Whatever was coming next, they would meet it together. And for the first time since she'd been brought to the mountains, Clara felt certain that together might be enough. The snow along the ridge had only just begun to recede when the next rider came. This one was different from Marshal Reed. His approach was measured, the kind of pace that didn't rush, but didn't waste time either. Elias was the first to see him. He stood on the porch, his rifle resting casually against the rail, though his eyes told Clara he was measuring the distance to the door. Samuel emerged from the shed, wiping his hands on his trousers, and followed the man's path with the same wariness. The rider dismounted in front of the cabin, brushing dust from his coat before removing his hat. His hair was graying at the temples, his face deeply lined in a way that spoke more of judgment than age. "Name's Bernard Lyle," he said. "Sheriff out of Lewis and Clark County. I'm here about Helena." Clara stepped out beside Elias, the chill wind tugging at the hem of her skirt. "Helena doesn't have anything left for me," she said. "Maybe not for you," Lyle replied, "but you've got something for it." He drew a folded paper from his coat and held it out. "We found the preacher's ledger. Names, dates, transactions. Your name is in there, along with others." Clara's stomach turned at the thought of it, her life reduced to ink on a page, a line in some filthy account book. Lyle's voice was calm, but there was a steel thread in it. "Your testimony could see the rest of them put away. The ones who still think this sort of thing can be done in the dark without consequence." "I've given enough," Clara said. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "I can't force you. But there are girls still where you were. You speak, you don't just close the door on your own past. You open it for theirs." He left the papers on the porch rail mounted up and rode away without looking back. For the rest of the day, the cabin felt too small. Samuel pretended to focus on his chores, but he watched her from the corner of his eye. Elias said nothing, but she could feel his gaze when she moved through the room. That night, when the fire had burned low and Samuel had gone to bed, Elias finally spoke. "Do you want to go?" She stared into the flames. I want to help. But I'm scared if I see them again, I'll go back to being her, the girl they broke. You won't, he said, his voice steady. You couldn't if you tried. That girl's gone. What's left is stronger than they know. 3 mornings later, she left with Elias. Samuel stayed behind to watch Whiskey and the cabin, his shoulders set with a seriousness beyond his years. The trail down felt both shorter and longer than she remembered the miles, marked not by fatigue, but by the weight of what lay ahead. The courthouse in Helena was packed. Faces she recognized and faces she didn't filled the benches, their eyes following her as she stepped to the front. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust. When they asked her to speak, she didn't look at the preacher's allies or the men who'd once carried her name like a curse. She looked at the women, some older, some heartbreakingly young, whose names had shared the page with hers. She told them everything. How her father had traded her away to settle a debt. How the preacher had blessed the exchange as though it were a holy act. How she had been left on a mountain with a stranger and expected to disappear. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke until the truth filled every corner of the room. When she finished, the silence was thick enough to hear the creak of the floorboards under her boots. By the week's end, warrants had been issued. The preacher was already gone, vanished like smoke, but others were arrested. Her father was taken into custody without anyone stepping forward to defend him. The ledger was entered into evidence, its pages preserved, so no one could claim it had never existed. When it was over, Clara walked out into the spring sunlight. The air tasted cleaner than it had on the ride down. Elias was waiting by the hitching post, his eyes holding the question he didn't need to speak. "It's done," she told him. The journey back up the mountain felt different this time. There was no dread in the climb, no sense of exile. She carried the silence of the courthouse with her, but it was no longer the silence of shame. It was the quiet of something closed and finished. Summer came, and with it small joys. Elias carved a new door for the cabin, its frame sanded smooth and fitted so tight the wind couldn't slip through. Clara planted lilacs along the front, the first touch of color the place had ever known. Samuel took work guiding trappers and travelers through the Bitterroot passes, but he always came home with the first frost. Grace was born the following year, her cries sharp and certain from the moment she arrived. Elias carved her a cradle from juniper wood, its headboard etched with the curve of the mountains. Clara spent hours rocking her there, the scent of the wood mingling with the faint sweetness of the lilacs outside. Years passed in the rhythm of the seasons. Samuel grew into the kind of man who could read the weather by the taste of the air. Elias's beard silvered, his movements slowed, but his eyes stayed sharp. Grace learned the names of the trees and the calls of the birds before she knew the letters of the alphabet. When Elias died, it was in the early light of a winter morning. Clara sat with him until the last breath left him, her hand resting over his. There was no fear in his face, only the peace of a man who had stayed where he was needed until the end. They buried him beneath the spruce behind the cabin, the one that caught the first light at dawn. Samuel came home for the burial and stayed through the thaw, his presence a quiet comfort. In the years that followed, the mountain never felt empty. Clara saw Elias in the grain of the wood he'd worked in, the way Grace laughed in the silence that filled the evenings, a silence that no longer pressed but held. People in Helena spoke her name differently now, not as a scandal or a warning, but as a story of what it meant to survive and to stand. Girls she had never met would come up the trail in the summer months just to see the cabin, just to see her. She welcomed them all, fed them at her table, sent them back down with food and blankets when they needed it. One autumn evening, long after the first frost had touched the lilacs, Clara stood on the porch watching Grace and Samuel's children chase each other through the gold-tipped grass. The air was sharp and full of wood smoke, the kind of air that promised snow. She thought of the path that had brought her here, the wagon ride into exile, the fear, the fight, the years of quiet building. From punishment had come purpose. From abandonment had come a home. And as the wind moved through the spruce, she could almost hear Elias's voice, steady as ever, reminding her together had always been enough. Clara Evans's story began on a morning that should have been like any other, but instead became the day her old life was cut away from her. At 18, carrying the child of the sheriff's son, she was not offered compassion, understanding, or even the chance to explain. Her father saw only shame, and in his eyes she was no longer a daughter, she was a debt to be erased. With no warning, he dragged her from her bed, loaded her into a wagon, and drove her deep into the Bitterroot Mountains in the dead of winter. There, in the biting cold, he handed her over to Elias Cole, a solitary mountain trapper, as payment for an old favor. There were no goodbyes, only the creak of the wagon wheels fading into the trees, leaving Clara barefoot in the snow, unwanted and unseen. The cabin Elias lived in was no refuge at first. It was bare, utilitarian, and cold in spirit, just like the man who kept it. He didn't speak much, didn't ask questions, and seemed to regard Clara with the same detached acceptance he gave to a sack of feed. For days, the silence between them was as sharp as the wind outside. Clara cleaned, cooked as best she could, and tried to make herself useful, but Elias gave no sign of approval or disapproval. Her isolation was complete, cut off from her home, her mother, her past, and now living alongside a stranger who seemed carved from stone. It was only when her pregnancy faltered, sharp pain, sudden bleeding, that the first crack appeared in Elias's shell. Without hesitation, he lifted her into the cot, tended the fire, boiled water, and stayed by her side through the long, uncertain hours. His voice remained steady, his hands careful. The life inside her survived, and with it something small but undeniable began to grow between them. Trust. The months that followed were marked by slow, unspoken change. Elias stitched her boots, left extra blankets near the fire, and built a small shelter for Whiskey, the half-starved mule he rescued during a blizzard. Clara, in turn, began to see the man behind the silence, a man with a past marked by war loss and grief, who had learned that words often failed where actions could speak louder. Her world shifted again when Samuel, her younger brother, appeared at the cabin's door, exhausted and nearly frozen. He brought news that their father had fled Helena after whispers began about the truth behind her exile, and their mother lay gravely ill. Despite the risks, Clara decided to return with Samuel to see her mother one last time. The journey back was perilous, but on that road, facing down a cougar, enduring the stares of the townspeople, Clara realized that fear no longer had the same hold on her. Her mother's apology was quiet, raw, and too late to change the past, but it was real. When her mother died days later, Clara buried her with a clear mind and an unbowed head. She refused to stay in Helena's shadow of judgment. Instead, she brought Samuel back with her to the mountains where the three of them began to build something like a family. That fragile peace was soon tested. Word came from Marshall Reed that the preacher, the same man who had blessed her father's transaction, was stirring up trouble. Men were talking about finishing the job. Elias and Samuel set traps around the cabin while Clara prepared supplies and learned to handle a rifle. When the attack came, 3 men creeping through the trees under a moonless sky, their preparation held. One man fell into Samuel's snare, another surrendered under Elias's aim, and Clara herself stopped the last before he could run. They carried kerosene to burn the cabin. In their pockets were orders and payment from a wealthy merchant tied to the preacher. Even this victory didn't end it. Soon after Sheriff Bernard Lyle arrived with evidence, the preacher's ledger filled with names of women sold or traded like property. Clara's was among them. She was asked to testify not for herself alone, but for the others who still lived in the same shadow she had escaped. Fear battled with resolve inside her, but she knew she couldn't turn away. In a packed courthouse, Clara told her story without tears and without hesitation. She laid bare the truth of her father's betrayal, the preacher's corruption, and the life she had built when the world expected her to vanish. Her words rippled through the town, leaving no room for doubt. Arrests followed. The preacher fled. Her father was taken into custody with no one to speak for him. When Clara returned to the mountain, she carried not the weight of shame, but the strength of survival. Life, from then on, unfolded in quiet, deliberate chapters. She planted lilacs along the front of the cabin. Elias carved her a ring from juniper wood, and they married without ceremony under the spruce that would one day shade his grave. Samuel became a respected guide, returning with the first frost each year. Grace, their daughter, grew up fearless, learning the ways of the mountains as naturally as other children learned their letters. Years passed. Elias aged, his movements slowing, but his presence steady until the day he left this world in the soft light of morning. Clara buried him beneath the spruce, the scent of lilac on the wind. She stayed in the cabin, her hair silvering her hands still strong. Word of her life traveled beyond Helena, her name becoming not a warning, but a testament to resilience. Women came to see her, to sit at her table, to hear the truth from her lips. She welcomed them all. Looking back, her journey was marked by betrayals that could have broken her isolation, that could have hollowed her out, and danger that could have ended her life. But each of those moments was reshaped by choice, her choice to stand, to adapt, to keep moving towards something better, even when she couldn't see it yet. From being given away like property, she claimed the right to belong. From abandonment, she forged a home. From fear, she drew courage. The lesson in Clara Evans's life is as old as hardship itself, but as necessary now as it was in her time. You are not defined by what was done to you, but by what you decide to do after. The world may strip you of safety, reputation, and even the people you thought would stand by you, but it cannot take your agency unless you give it away. You can choose to let the cruelty of others shape you into something smaller, or you can shape yourself into something stronger. In today's world, the threats may not come as a preacher's vendetta or a father's betrayal, but in the form of voices both outside and inside that tell you you're not enough, that you're too broken, too far gone. Clara's story reminds us that even in the deepest winter there is the possibility of building a fire, of finding or creating the people who will stand beside you, of planting something that will bloom come spring. We can apply her lesson by recognizing the difference between what is ours to carry and what belongs to the people who wronged us. By refusing to carry their shame, we free ourselves to carry what matters: our own worth, our chosen family, our purpose. We can prepare for hardship not by hiding from it, but by knowing who we are when it arrives. And we can remember that sometimes the home we long for is not a place we return to, but a place we build from scratch, one choice at a time. If Clara's journey has moved you, if you found strength in her survival inspiration, in her courage or hope, in her quiet victories, then I invite you to stay with us for more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel, and together we'll keep these tales alive, not just as echoes of the past, but as reminders of what we're capable of today. Your support gives us the fire to bring you the next story, the next voice that deserves to be heard. And who knows, the next one might just change the way you see your own life.